Welcome to a special edition of the Cinelex podcast. My name is Hakeem Lashnani. Today we're talking about police brutality in America in the wake of the George Floyd murder. In the last part 1, we discussed the problems of police brutality and how they manifest. In this part 2, we'll be talking about the reaction and responses to the George Floyd murder. And in part 3, we'll be discussing possible solutions to the police brutality problem. Check the timestamps in the description below to skip to any part of the podcast.
Just before we get into like smaller responses, I think when it comes to the response that probably is the most important, how do you guys feel about the response, if any, that we've gotten from Trump about all of this?
Obviously not
weak is
terrible, atrocious.
I was never the biggest Trump supporter, but I was also never really the biggest Trump hater. I think like the biggest
Give him a chance type of guy.
I mean, he's had way too many chances. He's like extremely hit or miss times.
I guess they never miss, huh?
Anyway,
Never
yeah,
mind.
Trump's nothing response for the longest time to the weird ass picture that he took in front of the church. Like, I don't know what he was trying to do. It
Not
just
photo
wasn't.
op, yeah.
With the upside down Bible, bruh.
Hey, listen, if Bush could do it, why not him?
I mean, the thing is that like the recent executive order is basically a nothing burger. It doesn't really do anything. Of course, the federal government doesn't really have too much power when it comes to like, directing state or local precincts, but federal police departments could be affected by legislation in Congress. And the thing is, of course, Trump's proper response would be to sign a bill into law. If he was out here vetoing a criminal reform or police reform bill, that's like all hell breaks loose. But it isn't usually the president's job, and this is like my inner libertarian community, to solve this problem on his own. It would have been very helpful if he was a little bit more coherent and helpful on social media, because he loves to use Twitter.
Okay. Well, I mean, going off that, it is the president's job to kind of be like a figurehead, exactly. Like, he's supposed to be a leader. And with his words, just the way he words things, you saw the protests with people who don't want to be locked inside and outside with the guns, and how he's saying those are nice people versus people who are out here protesting racism and calling them looters and thugs and all of that. Just the type of words that he chooses kind of fuels this hate in the country that we don't really need right now. And just from a leader standpoint, I think he's been terrible throughout this entire thing.
I can't say I disagree.
I completely agree with you, and I think that the leadership point is the point on which he's failed the most, because he had it's sort of amazing watching these past few months, because I've never seen, not that I've had a long life of watching politics, but I've never seen somebody tank their chances of winning re-election despite having all the cards in their favor as much as I've seen Trump do it. It's absolutely amazing.
Against current Biden too.
Against one of the weakest candidates to ever come out. But
I don't know about ever.
You know, if he had,
I mean, 2016 was pretty bad.
Hey, y'all know what Aleppo is?
If Trump had extended,
I would vote for him.
Right? If Trump had, if after the George Floyd killings, and I know that on paper, people who defend Trump are going to say, "Hey, look, he said that George Floyd's killing was terrible." But it's one thing to say something; it's another thing to tear gas protesters and for a photo op. You know, if he had extended an olive branch and he had said, "Okay, I recognize there's a problem. Here are 3 things I'd like to implement to help solve the problem. You know, we're going to demand body cams. We're going to do this." Even if those 3 things were not terribly significant and really didn't get to the heart of the problem. If he had extended an olive branch like that, I think people would have appreciated it, and the protest response that we see here wouldn't have been what it was. I think that because people know that he's not going to extend an olive branch, and people know that he's not really hiding his opinions or his racism in any sense. He is who he is. His public persona is his real self. At least that's what I think. And
I don't.
I think that people, I think that what's happening now is that people are protesting at local levels for local change because they feel as though as long as Trump is president, there's no hope for federal change.
Okay.
Yes, I agree.
To take it away, take it back to the policing a little bit. I would say my one fear is that we get like federal policing across the country, right? Because you're
Libertarian's worst nightmare.
Yeah, you don't want to expand the powers federally. So like, I think that's my one fear from like Trump just being like, yeah, we're gonna more or less expand our control of your local policing. That's very dangerous. But his figurehead response was pretty much garbage all around. I would say that.
I just want to say
to the past, like to a lot of things, in the sense that
Corona included.
Oh my God, Corona.
Corona's the worst in the sense that it's like one thing. Oh, it's a hoax. Oh, it's real. Oh, I've done a great job. And the other
We've
thing
only
too
had
is,
this many deaths. It's not that bad.
but it's not just that his response is bad in terms of what he does. It's also he's unable to motivate people, first of all, because he says the wrong stuff, and also because he doesn't know how to say it. He lacks a basic command of the English language. I mean, he was asked, how did he test for COVID? He's like, I tested positively negative. The doctor said it was the most negative test they had ever seen.
The doctors are looking into injecting a disinfectant.
No, I think he was
bleach or whatever, and
he's
UV light
memeing.
or something. I don't know.
No, okay, but I just wanted to mention going off of that. It's very obvious that Trump is very self-serving and self-centered. There's very much about his own image instead of the American people. He isn't very patriotic at all, and there's way more about his legacy than actual policy proposals. And not even if, like, of course, that's best case scenario. Trump actually proposes solutions and becomes a leader. No, I mean, I just want his first tweet about George Floyd, like, pay some fucking respects or homage, but instead, his very first tweet about George Floyd is using George Floyd's name to attack an enemy. Like, oh, George Floyd would not wish this. Like, that's the very first thing he talks about George Floyd. Like you can tell he only cares about himself and his fucking little friends or something. Like, and this is me, like, again, like, full disclosure, president of the college Republicans at my school. Trump is just absolutely miserable in 2020. He went from a meme to a disaster.
I think just recently,
yeah,
he put out a tweet calling the something about the I forgot his name, that 75-year-old who got pushed.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember his name, but yeah, I think he recently put out a tweet about how he was an Antifa, so it's actually not that bad or something. I'm not sure, but I don't know, man. Is
there a single member of Antifa who's over the age of 25 and doesn't live in their mom's basement? Come on.
It's like, I honestly wanted to be like, I started off with the whole, like the like if we're a plane, well, he's the pilot, so I have to give him the benefit of the doubt and hope for the best. But it's like, dude, just I guess I can't be too surprised that he's let me down, but it's like, I was hoping you wouldn't.
Like, generally, like, 2016 to, like, 2019, like, of course, like, he's not the best person. He's rude. He's, like, yeah, you can have so many complaints about him, but this past, like, 5 months specifically have been one of the worst presidencies, like, it's one of the worst years in presidencies. Basically, the country is falling apart in multiple ways. Of course, a lot of it is due to a pandemic, which is of some fault president because of the way he handled it. But at the same time, like, obviously, America's not looking too good right now. It's probably the worst that it's been in decades, and it's under his presidency. And that will definitely be what cements his legacy. And I'm pretty sure that's why he's gone into such damage control to try and fix that. And in the end, he's only making it worse. And that's just giving him the benefit of the doubt.
Did he have a rally?
He's
Yeah,
having
he
one,
has
I
a
believe
rally.
so. And
It's
He's had
going
multiple
on.
rallies. This
The
is not the
big
time to
rally's
be having
going on.
rallies.
I wonder how that went.
His rallies aren't being televised as much because they've been extra thin, his own standards. Like his rallies are, of course, having less people because of social distancing. But also his numbers, just his what's the word, approval rating amongst Republicans is at an all-time low. So, like, obviously, he's probably trying to go into overdrive and salvage what he has, but in the end, it's just him digging his own hole deeper and deeper.
one of my favorite things I have to say that's come out of his presidency is the "Don't Trust China" meme. I don't know if you know it, but the Donald Trump "Don't Trust China" meme is. I think that's the best thing his presidency
Well, I
has.
haven't seen it.
I'll shoot you the video later, but that's one of the best things that's come out of his presidency, and it wasn't even from him directly. But anyway, digressing from Trump, because we could probably have a whole segment on just his presidency, focusing really on individuals and companies. How do you guys see the responses? Because I know, like for example, Minneapolis said they were going to commit to dismantling the police. Now, there was no real explanation as to what that means. Wait, hold on, give me a second.
If you want, I can go on a bit of like a discussion of this topic because I have some strong opinions that you may or may not agree with. But
I'm back. But just to finish, but yeah, so for example, Minneapolis said they're committed to dismantling the police. There was no real explanation as to what that means. They just said they would do it. And it seems so far people have accepted that as like, okay, great. New York basically did the same thing. They pledged that big reform was coming. Again, there's no real explanation as to what that means. All we know so far is that there is going to be some funding redirection towards youth and social services. And besides that, it's like a few databases have been set up to record police brutality. But even that, it's like, it's not this, if I remember correctly, it's not the state doing it. It's just like a group of individuals who've decided they're going to create some database where all that stuff can be logged and whatnot. So in terms of the responses that we're seeing to the current protest, do you guys feel that they're adequate given how large of a movement this was? Because I mean, we have to remember this was international. Now, I don't know if that's because people were bored of being home or because of Corona, and because they had nothing else to do, they saw all this stuff happening, and maybe this is their first time realizing just how bad it is, or I don't know if it's that or maybe if it was boredom, but either way, point still stands that this is probably the biggest support this type of movement has seen in the country in the last decade or so. So given all of that, do you feel that the current responses we've seen are adequate?
not nearly enough, in a word, at least in my opinion. I think that there have been good indications, obviously, but the good indicators, I think, mostly come from the fact that there are a lot of people protesting rather than legitimate recognition of what the problems are and legitimate efforts to how to solve them. Now, on one hand, I think that's the problem with the people protesting, in the sense that a lot of people are protesting, saying Black Lives Matter, saying I can't breathe, saying all these things, and essentially those kind of protests I see as raising awareness, but I don't see why you need to do that. Awareness is raised. What you need to do, at least, not saying you shouldn't do that, but I'm saying that what we also need are protests that have actionable demands, in the sense that protests that say we want these 3 things to happen, we want them to happen this soon, we
A la
think
Hong
these are the
Kong?
things. That's perfect example. Hong Kong protests have been well executed in that sense, and I think that it's the onus is on both organizations. Or the onus is on the lawmakers to think up solutions, and on people protesting to think about what solutions they want, and people like us, just general citizens, to think about how to solve the problem. I think that to get proper reform done, you're going to need to have things that happen at the legislative level and at the enforcement level, in terms of police reform within police departments, and then police reform outside of the departments in terms of the law. I think that the current response is going to be much more local than it is federal, and I think that's okay. I mean, most police force is local anyway, so the response is going to have to be local if it's going to be within police departments. Where I think the response is mostly failing is that it seems as though the police, at least from what I can see, when after George Floyd was murdered and there was the initial wave of protests, the police responded by being more on edge and more violent and essentially more militarized. And then that led to a second wave of protests, and there's been a back and forth. Now, whenever that happens, eventually I think that the police are going to lose that battle if they try to stamp this out, because they're simply they're going to lose the battle of public opinion, which is what we see in Atlanta, right? Where now the cops aren't even showing up to work. They're just like, okay, that's it. We can't win this thing just by trying to sort of flex our muscles. And I think that is not ideal, but it shows that over time people have a tremendous amount of influence when they gather and let their voices be known. And that even though the police, they have all this power, this legal power, whatever, because they're paid for by the taxpayer, eventually all of that succumbs to the power of the people.
Well said.
Yeah, of course. And it's obviously extremely difficult for a correct solution to be made in such a short amount of time.
Ooh.
It's bigger than black and white. It's a problem with the whole way of life. It can't change overnight. You got to start somewhere. And one issue with protesters being able to form solid demands in countries specifically is that there's such a variety of opinions. With some protesters, of course, wanting most basic of reforms that should have been implemented a long time ago, where everyone could agree on that. And then there are some protesters who want like a complete abolishing of the police state, or like anarcho-communist type of utopia that's already been developing in CHAZ. So that's why the protests that raise awareness are still necessary, and I would believe are the most important. And of course, it's on the lawmakers to make sound decisions. And I'll go more deeply into this when we start talking about solutions. I'm actually not that opposed to redistribution of responsibility away from police officers, because like
I'll support you on that.
We all agree that the police officers' training tends to be insufficient when it comes to a vast majority of situations. Statistically, a vast majority of police officers' shootings are towards people who are mentally ill, to say it abrasively. Like a vast majority of police shootings are, again, just people who can't respond to orders as quickly or as what's the word? I'm not going to get too deep into it, but what I'm trying to make is that diffusing responsibility is definitely a good idea. Like whether or not it's specifically defunding or at least just reducing the burden that police officers have is probably a really good thing to come out of the recent protests. It's an idea that I haven't really thought of before, but when you're presented with it, it's like, oh, yeah, this makes sense.
Also like that idea. What do you guys think about the people who say, where is this type of response with black on black crime versus police brutality?
That's like talking about like have a problem with like
Another
water and you're complaining about like why do deserts. I don't know. I'm trying to make a random analogy. I don't think they're related. That's the point.
Yeah, black on black crime as well. It's like in general, people will tend to live with or close to people who look like themselves. So just by default, if you are black, you're most likely to, if you committed murder, it's most likely going to be somebody that's black. But not just that. If you look at the murders, most murders that are black on black are generally gang related. And if you want to go into why
Gangs exist.
yeah,
Most
that's like a
murders-
lot of socioeconomic talk right there.
Exactly.
Basically, all murders are intra-racial, like
Also,
towards what your own particular subracial group is.
Yeah.
Like a vast majority of murders are like that anyway. And additionally, notice that these cases of police brutality, of police killings, if it made sense, let's just say like if police killings were justified, then you would see them happening more often in inner city Baltimore, inner city Chicago. The fact of the matter is that these places are actually completely under-policed. You do not see police in this area enforcing laws. You do not see police going into areas of high crime or gang violence and solving that. You more see people in suburban areas being stopped, frisked, harassed, arrested, accosted, and in some cases shot. So it's like, okay, what about black and black crime? It's not gang members that are being shot by police. It's just random suburban African Americans and mentally ill patients and just people in general. And forgive me for some of my word choices because I feel like I'm not articulating my thoughts correctly. But the point is, just to summarize, black and black crime as a counter argument is basically useless because it's not actually directly addressing issue that the argument entails, and even if it did, the reality is that cops are not going into extremely high crime situations like gang violence and going into those situations and killing people. Instead, it's in areas where there isn't a major crime being committed, and that's why it's a non-issue, at least in my opinion.
Also, if I'm taking the best, my personal view of the best iteration of defund the police, which is like just demilitarizing them, and reallocating those funds to more community-based, community building activities, I would say, then I think the goal is you would end up reducing that black on black crime, even if. So, if you take the best scenario of defund the police, you are dealing with both issues. So if you bring up both, they're both related.
How so?
You're
Because
dealing with
again-
like socioeconomic issues. He's
Yeah,
trying to say.
So like if you like drop police funding by like 10%, you like, let's say, put that money into after school activities or something, right?
Oh, okay.
Then people have something to do after school, and it end up in turn in maybe like 10 years dropping.
I missed that part, and I thought you were trying to say, well, if there are no cops, gangs are going to stop shooting each other.
No.
I was kind of...
No one's making that point. Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't understanding that. Yeah, I get you.
I think we all agree that absolutely no policing of any sort just leads to disaster. I'm Ethiopian. Somalia is a great example. A lack of any structure there has turned it into a wasteland. Forgive me, my Somali brothers, but sisters. Yeah, and also see CHAZ. There are no major crimes yet, but you see like extortion and other similar acts being commonplace according to
There are
news media.
a lot
Like
of...
you really don't know what's going on there, though.
I've heard, and again, you can't really be sure what's happening inside of CHAZ, but there have been instances, or so I've read, of people it's basically trying to break into women's tents, and given that there is no like local police or whatever, it's either you have the people around you come help you, or you're in trouble. There's been a lot of theft. They excuse that theft as just see it as someone probably needed it more than you, so your goods got redistributed to somebody in a worse situation than you did. So think of it as like a impromptu donation. CHAZ, I don't know, CHAZ is a weird place, but I think we probably agree that CHAZ is not a representation of anything really having to do with the current black struggle in America. Because really, when you look at it, it's like a bunch of
You don't
white
see very
Antifa
many.
people. It's like CHAZ is not related to what we're trying to do.
But where I disagree with what Isaac was saying is that I don't think that the most inner cities are under policed. And I understand that there is high levels of crime there, but I think you need to take a second look at what that crime is. So, for example, if a lot of it is drug crime, yeah, drug related crime is crime, but the solution to drug related crime is not police. The solution is mental health institutions, rehabilitation centers, places for people to get educated on the negative effects of drugs. That's the solution to that kind of crime.
And arguably legalization, especially for like weed.
Yeah, and legalization.
Being a libertarian, like I believe that the war on drugs was absolutely garbage, and actually drugs like cocaine and heroin should be decriminalized. Yeah. That's a whole different conversation.
But if you look at something like let's say you say theft is a huge problem, right? So yeah, there's a high crime rate, there's a lot of theft going on. Maybe half of the solution is policing, but the other half of the solution is better educational systems that give the people the tools necessary to go out and get jobs in the workplace that would allow them to sustain themselves so that they're not resorting to thievery. I really, really, really don't think that most people are out there being like, what can I do today? Let me go out and steal some shit. It's like those were the looters you saw in Minneapolis. They were like, they're a small minority. Most people are saying, I don't have anything. I can't put food on the table. I need to find a way to get something. And I think that if you offer these people alternative ways to get food on the table, they'll take them. And there's ways to, and there should be systems in place to do that. So while I agree that there's a lot of problems in these communities, crime on quote unquote crime related problems, generally those problems are not solved by increased police presence.
And I just wanted to quickly say that I completely agree with you. I probably misspoke when I used the word under policing. I mentioned that in response to lack of a correlation between police shooting African Americans who are probably like, you don't see police officers intervening in gang fights and getting to shootouts with gangs like they do in GTA. Like you see like a bunch of people rioting. And firstly, I'd like to shout out this podcast conversation. We haven't mentioned rioting for hours, and when rioting happens, the police are under-equipped to handle situations, so they don't do it. You don't see police officers going into, theoretically, if they get info that there's going to be a gang war, they don't go into it. Or that's the point I was trying to make, in which you do not see police officers shooting armed black men in gangs. You see them shooting unarmed black men or people minding their own business, at least anecdotally, way more often. And I was basically just trying to say, if these shootings were a little bit less racial and more logical, it would be heavily concentrated in places like Baltimore and Chicago and LA and stuff, but they're not. That's the issue. Of course, I agree with you completely that there's so many things that could be done instead of just over policing or increasing the police presence to solving multiple issues completely unrelated to race and especially related to race. Yeah.
So it seems like a lot of the answers seem to be going into that solution category. So so probably we'll get into that unless anybody has a final point they want to make on the current responses.
No.
All right. But all right, so before we go into talking about solutions, a lot of we mentioned the whole defunding the police and whatnot. What do you guys believe that the wording is important, right? Because think, for example, when BLM first made their slogan, the Black Lives Matter, right? The immediate response was, what about other lives, right? And then they had to come out and explain, well, it's not that other lives don't matter, right? It's just that seemingly it would seem that Black lives don't matter as much as everyone else's. And again, now with the police defunding, right? It didn't even start off as defund the police. It started off as abolish the police, and it took a lot of contention, a lot of arguing, right? The immediate reaction was, how could you possibly think this? There's no way I'm supporting this, right? And through discussion there, yes, it came out that it's not actually necessarily abolish the police. In some cases, some people do want to completely abolish the police, but through discussion, they came to realize that it's more so a defunding and redistribution of the wealth. So with that being said, before we move on to solutions, how important do you think the wording is when we come out with these big ideas?
I heard a joke. Actually, I forgot what stand-up routine it was. It was like using it was basically on the dichotomy between like Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. So BLM, very popular catchphrase, very easy to remember. Other ideas that might have been included are BLAM, Black Lives Also Matter, but BLAM kind of sounds violent, and there's already the stereotype that Black people, blah, blah, blah. So that's not a good idea. Black Lives Matter 2, BLMT, that's one letter away from a sandwich working. Those types of jokes, like comedy is always like downstream, like truth or what people are thinking. And of course, the wording is important when it comes to legislation, especially when it comes to just like a movement. Black Lives Matter. Of course, not everyone in Black Lives Matter holds the same opinions. There's a wide variety of opinions of solutions and not. But like Black Lives Matter and the response All Lives Matter seems kind of childish to me. Feels so much like a no you me in real life, where I don't think there's a single Black Lives Matter admin per se that thinks that only Black Lives Matter. I'm pretty sure there's extremists on all sides, but the issue is that Black lives need to matter more. They should matter more. They also matter. They matter too. The point of like the movement, not hey, these lives don't matter. You know what I mean?
I think that going off of your jokes point, I think that one of the best things that I heard was that saying all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter is like you wearing a shirt that says all buildings matter on 9/11, which is to say that, yeah, sure, all buildings matter, but on 9/11, people are thinking about the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, not other random buildings in random places, right? So with the Black Lives Matter, it's the same thing. Like, no one's saying that all lives don't matter. They're saying that Black lives do matter. Now, I personally do not like the way Black Lives Matter operates as an organization, because I think they care actually a lot more about white perpetrators than they care about Black lives. But I do understand the point that they're trying to make, in the sense that historically, Black lives have been treated as less than white lives. And going back to what you were saying, Yvonne, your original question, I think the wording matters a lot. I think if you look back at the most recent successful widespread national political movement, I think it is the legalization of gay marriage and generally the Pride movement, which is to say that 15 years ago, being openly gay was really not accepted the way it was today. And a lot of change has been made recently. And by recently, I mean the past like 15, 20 years, in our lifetime, essentially.
Just to interrupt, bro, when we were kids, it's so cringe. Like two adults can't fucking marry.
Hey.
Two consenting adults, bro, cringe.
Yeah.
I was a kid. Life changes pretty quickly. Shout out to progressivism. It's no, jokes aside, you're right, 100%.
And so I think that if you look at the Pride movement, one of the things that was the most effective is how their wording was very specific, in the sense that they didn't say we want to be able to be partners. They didn't say we want to be able to legally copulate or anything. It was nothing complex like that. It was very simply, we want to be able to get married. And so marriage was the word that they focused on, and that's what they wanted. That's what they wanted to have. And obviously, because the government gives you a tax break, there's a legal sense to the word marriage. But I think that it is important to focus on something, on one word, and not to make the word, and to pick it carefully, in the sense that if you go out and you say, we're going to abolish the police, then you may have a lot of people who sympathize with the Black Lives Matter movement, who would otherwise support it, but who don't want to go so far as to abolish the police, and they're going to not support your movement. So it's important to go and say, and to have at least the main point of your messaging. Obviously, you're going to have offshoots, whatever you do. But the main point of your messaging, I do think the wording is really important. And I'm not sure that, well, Black Lives Matter has pretty much become the slogan now. But if it ever gets to a point that Black Lives Matter is really arguing for some policy changes, I hope they pick the wording very carefully, because it does matter.
And I brought up the question because really, like, when you look at how long it took for people to, really get on board with saying Black Lives Matter, it took a while. And the reason it took that long was because of the wording, like the way it was phrased. And personally, I don't know right now that I could tell you a better way to say it. But though the point still stands that the way it's currently being said, at least at the time, it gave off a lot of opposition for some people. And similarly with the abolish the police, a lot of people are on board with the idea of maybe doing some refunding. But a majority of people are not on board with abolishing the police. Like, you will lose them completely if you go there. And the argument that I've seen being made is that they make it inflammatory because that encourages discussion. But if that means that you're going to have to wait, because when did BLM really start? Like 2014 or so? After Michael Brown, I believe. Well, 2013. So
sure, after George Zimmerman got acquitted.
If you're saying that you want defund the police or just reform the police to take from today, 2020, until, I don't know, 2028, before people actually start being like, oh, so you don't actually want to abolish the police, you want to do this. It's like, I don't think that's the smart approach, right? If we know what we mean, then let's say what we mean, right? So that way we can get the support from the get-go and get going as soon as possible. So in the case of that, you want something, when you're making like a slogan for like your movement or whatever, I feel like it's really challenging because you want it to be like a thread that leads people down the rabbit hole and like starts a conversation, like Yvonne said. But you don't want it to be the thing that is like, this sounds like the hill is so high that it doesn't even make sense. Like, which is the problem of abolish the police, right? Where it's like they're basically saying, delete this thing that basically keeps most of us safe and keeps a lot of people from being outright anarchists, right? But at the same time, you want to like have something that draws the attention and lets people start doing their own investigation into the issue. Yeah. Which is like, I feel like we're being a little bit armchair right now. I agree, but it's like, look at it this way, right? A lot of change comes from having power, right? And arguably in this country, power means either the numbers or a large amount of capital, right? We don't have the numbers, right? We're a minority, and we also don't have the capital. So what that means is for any movement that we create, we are going to need the support of the larger population in the country if we want to make a legitimate change. Yeah. And right, if you go tell some suburban white couple who enjoys the protection that they receive from the police, who realistically, through no fault of their own, they don't have to see, the same things that someone living in, I don't know, Flint, Michigan, or somewhere in Chicago sees every day, right? If you tell them that, hey, this police you have that keeps your neighborhood safe and whatnot, that police officer who drives by and sometimes plays with your kid, gives them some ice cream or whatever, we're taking that away from you. Right? They are not going to want to support you. So coming out the gate swinging so hard, like I agree, yeah, you want something that's going to get people thinking and really looking at the issue, but you also can't just go completely like off the field with something like abolish the police.
So
Because when you
like,
lose that support from the if you lose the support from the get go by getting them all scared and like, oh no, I can't do this. This sounds radical. It's much harder to get it back later on. And I would say the proof of that is simply how long it took for people to get on board with BLM.
for some reason, I was thinking about like the French Revolution. Revolution needs a majority opinion. A revolution needs people to be on the same page for changes to happen. Like, I don't know why I thought of the French Revolution. Like, it started off with like a solid set of decrees and demands, and then all of a sudden everyone's being executed by the guillotine, including the inventor of the guillotine. So it's like it kind of happens historically where change is necessary and change is wanted. There's everyone's on board with the idea that change needs to be done. The loudest voices and the most powerful voices in the revolution tend to be the most radical, and usually that leads to setbacks. But in the end, I'm still optimistic that because America's so driven and so on the same page with, hey, we need to do something about police. At the very end, I think that, although this is very optimistic, solutions that are needed to be made will be made. I'm just personally worried because of what you said. For example, there are the radical ideas that will be tried in certain areas and will likely fail in many areas. Like, that will happen inevitably because of how revolutions are and how the dynamics shift within a revolution. At least that's what I kind of see and observe.
I would say, like you, I'm pretty optimistic that I think we can see some good change in the future, right? And speaking of good change, I think it's time to finally change into solution mode, which I'm pretty sure all of you have been waiting for since we started, basically, because the first thing you guys did was start talking about solutions. And on that note, we've now reached the end of part 2 of our discussion on American policing. If, like some of us, you're eager to get into possible solutions, please head on over to part 3, which will be available through a link in the description below. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion so far and look forward to having you join us for the conclusion.